At 15, the world should feel like it's just beginning, a canvas waiting for colors, a road unfolding with endless possibilities. For me, though, it narrowed into a single, jagged memory, the night my parents threw me out and labeled me a burden. I can still hear my mother's voice, echoing in the kitchen as if it were happening all over again. "We can't keep doing this, Daniel," she snapped at my father. "She's nothing but dead weight. All she does is doodle in those sketchbooks while other kids prepare for real careers. She's draining us." Her words pierced deeper than any knife. I was standing right there, clutching the corner of my worn backpack, a lump rising in my throat. My father didn't argue. He didn't defend me. He just nodded grimly, like the decision had been made weeks before. "You're 15 now, Lily," he said flatly, refusing to meet my eyes. "Old enough to figure things out. We can't support this fantasy of yours. You'll thank us one day." Fantasy. That's what they called my art, my sketches, my dream of one day painting murals that told stories words couldn't capture. I thought family was supposed to believe in you when no one else did. But that night, my family decided I wasn't worth the effort. They gave me 30 minutes to pack. 30 minutes to erase the idea that this house, this family was mine. I stuffed clothes into my backpack with trembling hands, sliding my sketchbook between them as though it were a lifeline. My mother stood at the doorway, arms crossed, glaring at me like I was an intruder overstaying my welcome. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit me harder than their rejection. It was early autumn, the kind of night when the wind carries a bite that seeps straight into your bones. I stood on the porch, waiting for one of them to call me back, to say they didn't mean it. But the door slammed shut. That sound, that hollow slam, became the anthem of my teenage years. For weeks, I bounced between park benches, bus stops, and the occasional shelter bed, if I was lucky. Hunger gnawed at me constantly. My stomach twisted in knots as I rationed packets of crackers, the only food I could afford after collecting loose change on sidewalks. Nights were the worst. The darkness pressed down on me, and the cold made every joint ache. I'd curl up on the ground, hugging my sketchbook to my chest, sketching under dim streetlights whenever I could. My drawings were the only proof I was still me.
People looked through me as though I didn't exist.
Couples passed by, laughing, their shopping bags swinging. Office workers hurried home, their warm coats brushing against me as they walked past without seeing. I became invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of their perfect lives. But I wasn't invisible to everyone. Some nights, I caught the attention of strangers who weren't kind. Drunks stumbled out of bars, eyeing me with a mixture of curiosity and malice. I learned to move quickly, to find corners where the streetlights didn't quite reach, places where I could disappear. At 15, I learned survival the hard way. And yet, even in that storm of loneliness and fear, a tiny ember of defiance burned inside me. If my parents thought I'd give up, they were wrong. Every cruel word they'd spoken replayed in my head like fuel. Burden. Dead weight. Fantasy.
Fine.
I'd prove them wrong. Still, proving them wrong seemed impossible when every day was a battle just to exist. My shoes wore thin. My hands cracked from the cold. I started to wonder if I'd simply vanish one night and no one would notice. Until Harold found me. My grandfather wasn't the type of man you expected to swoop in and rescue anyone. He lived quietly, tucked away in his modest but warm house on the edge of Portland. I hadn't seen him in years. My parents rarely spoke of him except to dismiss him as eccentric and old-fashioned. But one night, as I sat sketching on a park bench near downtown, I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. "Lily," a deep, familiar voice asked. I looked up, startled. His face was older than I remembered, his hair thinner and silver, but his eyes, they were the same warm, steady hazel I recalled from childhood visits. "Grandpa Harold?" My voice cracked, disbelief mingling with shame. He looked me over, the hollow cheeks, the worn clothes, the backpack clutched to my chest. His jaw tightened, not in judgment, but in sorrow. "What are you doing out here, child?" Tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed for weeks spilled over. I wanted to lie, to pretend I wasn't as broken as I felt. But the truth clawed its way out between sobs. They didn't want me anymore. Harold didn't hesitate. He pulled me into his arms, wrapping me in a coat that smelled faintly of pine and tobacco. "Then they're fools," he said firmly, voice vibrating with conviction. "You'll come home with me." And just like that, for the first time since being thrown out, I wasn't alone. Grandpa Harold's house wasn't grand or flashy. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to be the foundation of a $20 million estate. But to me, it felt like a palace the moment I stepped through the door. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of wood polish and fresh bread. The walls were lined with bookshelves and framed landscapes, scenes he'd painted himself, though he never called himself an artist. "Make yourself at home," he said, guiding me inside. His voice was steady, not pitying. That mattered. I had grown used to pity from strangers, thin smiles, a dollar dropped into my hand with eyes averted. Harold looked at me like I was a person, not a problem. He led me to the kitchen, where a plate of roast chicken and mashed potatoes waited. My hands trembled as I picked up the fork, trying not to devour it too quickly, but hunger won. Harold sat across from me, sipping tea, not rushing me, not questioning me. When I finally slowed, he spoke. "I knew your parents had their priorities, but to abandon their own daughter?" He shook his head, sorrow flickering in his eyes. "That's a cruelty I'll never understand." I lowered my gaze, ashamed. They said I was a burden, that my art was a waste. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood. He walked to a shelf and pulled down a sketchbook, worn leather, the pages yellowed with age. He set it in front of me. Inside were drawings, careful and detailed. A young Harold had sketched forests, rivers, faces of people I didn't recognize. "I wasted my life in business meetings," he said softly. "But these pages? These were my joy. If art is a waste, then I suppose I've wasted some of the best parts of my life." My chest tightened. It was the first time someone had validated the thing my parents dismissed so casually. That night, he gave me a bed with soft sheets, and for the first time in weeks, I slept without fear. The weeks turned into months, and Harold became more than a grandfather. He became a mentor, a confidant, a compass in a world that had spit me out. Every morning, he'd rise early, make oatmeal, and read the newspaper while I filled pages with sketches. Sometimes he'd sit with me, offering quiet observations. "You draw with your heart," he'd say. "That's something no school can teach." But it wasn't just art he taught me. Harold had lived through hard times, recessions, wars, betrayals of his own. He spoke of patience, of kindness, of the value of integrity when everything else fell apart. "Money," he told me one evening as we sat by the fire, "is a tool, not a master. Too many people worship it and lose themselves. Don't let that happen to you." I didn't understand the full weight of his words then, but I listened. School was another challenge. Enrolling me again meant confronting questions. Why had I been absent? Why had I moved? Harold handled it with calm authority, signing papers, smoothing over inquiries with that quiet dignity he carried everywhere. He never once made me feel like I owed him for the trouble. Still, I struggled to fit in. My classmates whispered about the girl who had disappeared and come back living with her grandfather. Some mocked my thrift store clothes. Others rolled their eyes when I carried sketchbooks instead of designer handbags. But every sneer only fueled me. When I felt small, I thought of Harold's words. "They're fools if they can't see your worth." One afternoon, as autumn leaves painted the streets in red and gold, Harold drove me to a local gallery. My hands sweated as I clutched my latest sketches, unsure why he'd brought me there. The gallery owner, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, examined my work with surprising intensity. "Raw talent," she finally said. "She sees the world differently. These pieces belong on a wall." I nearly choked on my own breath. A wall? In a gallery? Harold just smiled, as though he'd expected it all along. "See, Lily? You're not a burden. You're a gift." It was the first time I believed it. Life with Harold wasn't perfect. We had arguments, like when I stayed up too late drawing or when I neglected chores, but it was real. It was family in a way I hadn't known before. On weekends, we worked in his garden, planting vegetables and trimming roses. Sometimes, we took long walks along the Willamette River, where he told me stories about his youth, how he'd started with nothing, how he'd built his fortune not by chasing greed, but by making steady, honest choices. What struck me most was his humility. He drove an old truck. He wore the same flannel shirts year after year. No one in the neighborhood suspected the quiet man with kind eyes was sitting on a multi-million-dollar estate. I once asked him why he never flaunted his wealth. He chuckled. Because real wealth isn't for flaunting, child. It's for protecting, for sharing wisely. Money reveals people's true nature. You'll see that one day. I didn't know then how prophetic those words were. The years passed swiftly. With Harold's encouragement, I won a scholarship to an art program in Santa Fe. He hugged me the day I left, his voice rough with emotion. Go paint the world, Lily. And remember, your gift is bigger than their cruelty. I promised him I would, but no promise could shield me from the day everything changed, the day Harold's steady presence was taken from me. His passing came quietly, as if he'd simply drifted off in his sleep, leaving behind a silence too heavy for words. What followed was grief, so deep it threatened to swallow me. But grief wasn't the only thing that arrived. My parents did, too, draped in wealth, their luxury cars gleaming in the church parking lot, their designer clothes a cruel contrast to the tears I shed. They hadn't been there when I was starving. They hadn't cared when I was shivering on the streets. But now, with Harold gone, they came circling like vultures. And that's when Harold's lessons about money revealing true nature began to make sense. The morning of Harold's funeral was gray, the kind of day when the sky itself seemed to mourn. I wore a black dress he had once bought me for a school performance, its hem slightly faded, but full of memories. As I walked into the church, the scent of lilies clung to the air, mingling with the low murmur of hushed conversations. Every pew was filled. Neighbors, old friends, and colleagues Harold had quietly helped over the years. Some I recognized, others I didn't, but every single one spoke of the quiet impact he'd left on their lives. A man stood at the podium, voice trembling as he told how Harold had paid his medical bills when he couldn't afford treatment. A woman shared how Harold had anonymously funded her son's college tuition. I sat there, tears burning my eyes, realizing just how wide his circle of kindness had been. He hadn't only saved me, he'd saved countless others. And then, like a sharp stain on a pure canvas, my parents arrived. The sound of luxury tires crunching gravel drew everyone's attention. Two sleek black cars pulled up outside the church. Out stepped my mother, draped in a tailored dress that glittered with jewelry, her lips painted crimson. My father followed, adjusting his designer watch as though it mattered more than the solemnity of the occasion. The murmurs in the church grew louder. People shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. They knew the stories. They knew my parents had abandoned me. Yet here they were, strutting down the aisle as though the place belonged to them. My mother's eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on me. Her expression was unreadable. No apology, no regret, only calculation. My father nodded curtly at acquaintances, his lips pressed into a thin line of forced solemnity. I clenched my fists in my lap. They hadn't shown their faces for years. Not when I was homeless. Not when Harold nursed me back to life. But now, at the whisper of wealth, they appeared, perfectly groomed, like actors playing the role of grieving family. During the service, they sat at the front, as though they deserved the place of honor. My mother dabbed her eyes delicately with a silk handkerchief she probably bought on a shopping spree. But I noticed the tears never actually fell. When the pastor finished, and we followed Harold's casket to the cemetery, my parents trailed behind, their eyes darting around as though measuring the worth of every person, every detail. It was less about grief and more about anticipation. A week later, Harold's will was to be read. The lawyer's office smelled of leather and old books. I sat nervously in the chair, my palms damp, clutching the same sketchbook I'd carried since the night I was thrown out. My parents sat across from me, their designer coats folded neatly over the armrests, their postures straight and expectant. The lawyer, Mr. Bennet, was a tall man with a kind but firm presence. His silver-rimmed glasses caught the light as he opened a thick folder. "We are gathered to review the last will and testament of Mr. Harold Carter," he began. I glanced at my parents. My mother's lips curled in the faintest smile, as though she already knew the outcome. My father tapped his fingers impatiently against his knee, his mind no doubt racing through numbers. Mr. Bennet cleared his throat. "Before I read the will, Mr. Carter asked me to share something with you all." He reached into the folder and pulled out a letter written in Harold's distinct, careful handwriting. His voice carried each word like a weight. "To my family, I leave behind more than money. I leave behind lessons. I have witnessed how greed can rot the heart and how compassion can heal it. I have seen who stood by me when I had little to offer and who abandoned love when it was inconvenient. My decision may shock some, but it will not surprise those who truly knew me." The air in the room grew heavy. My mother shifted uncomfortably, though she tried to mask it with a practiced smile. Mr. Bennet continued. "Mr. Carter has documented instances of betrayal, neglect, and cruelty that influenced his decision. He entrusted me with journals, recordings, and letters that reveal the truth about his relationships." My father stiffened. "That's unnecessary," he muttered. But Mr. Bennet didn't flinch. He opened the official will. "All properties, investments, accounts, and assets, valued at approximately $20 million, are to be transferred to one individual, his granddaughter, Lily Carter." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. My mother's face strained of color. "What?" she gasped, her composure slipping. "That's absurd. We're his children. Surely there must be some mistake." Mr. Bennet adjusted his glasses. "There is no mistake. Mr. Carter was deliberate. He stated explicitly that his children, Daniel and Margaret Carter, were to inherit nothing due to what he termed willful abandonment and proven greed." My father surged to his feet, his face red. "He can't do this. He's punishing us for choices you made," Mr. Bennet interrupted firmly. "He could, and he did. Everything belongs to Lily." I sat frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Me? The sole heir? It felt unreal, like a dream I might wake from. My mother's mask cracked, anger seeping through. "Where is blood? You think you deserve it more than us? You. The little burden we carried for 15 years. Her words stung, but they no longer broke me. I met her gaze steadily. "Harold was more of a parent to me than either of you ever were.
He saw me. He believed in me.
And he knew the truth." The silence after that was deafening. My parents looked at me as though I were a stranger. In a way, I was no longer the scared girl they had discarded. I was the granddaughter who had inherited not only Harold's estate, but also his strength. Mr. Bennet closed the folder. "That concludes the will reading." My parents stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. But I stayed seated, my hands trembling around my sketchbook. $20 million. A fortune I had never dreamed of. Yet all I could think of was Harold's voice. Money is a tool, not a master. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. After the reading of the will, life didn't transform overnight the way fairy tales suggest. Yes, I was suddenly wealthy beyond imagination, but the money didn't erase the ache of Harold's absence. The house felt unbearably quiet without his laughter echoing down the hallway, without his footsteps pacing softly at dawn. I spent days wandering from room to room, touching objects that had once been ordinary but now felt sacred. The flannel jacket still hanging on a hook, the teacup stained with faint brown rings, the sketchbook he had left open on his desk. The money meant nothing in those moments. I would have traded it all for one more evening sitting beside him by the fire, listening to his gravelly voice tell stories of resilience. But Harold's voice lived on in memory, and I realized quickly what he meant for me to do. Money is a tool, not a master. Protect it. Share it wisely. The first test came sooner than expected. My parents weren't done with me. Barely a week after the will was finalized, I found them waiting at the gates of Harold's property, dressed in somber black as if still pretending to grieve. My father's jaw was set hard. My mother's face wore a brittle smile. "Lily," she said sweetly, as though the word itself could erase 15 years of cruelty. "We need to talk." I stood tall, the estate gates between us. "About what?" My father cleared his throat. "Look, maybe we overreacted when you were younger. We were under stress, finances were tight. But now we're family again. We should share in Harold's legacy together." The audacity of it left me momentarily speechless. They hadn't wanted me when I was starving, but now that I was the heiress, suddenly I was family? I shook my head. "You abandoned me. Harold didn't. You don't get to come back now because of money." My mother's smile faltered. "Think about appearances, Lily. What will people say if you cut out your own parents? It'll make you look ungrateful." Ungrateful. The word burned like acid. I owe my life to Harold. I owe you nothing. I turned and walked away, leaving them shouting empty threats at the gate. It was the last time I ever spoke to them. Instead of drowning in wealth the way they might have, I poured my energy into honoring Harold. I kept the house exactly as it was, living in it not as a museum of grief, but as a sanctuary of memory. The garden bloomed every spring under my care, roses and vegetables sprouting side by side, just as he liked. And with the inheritance, I built something new, a foundation in Harold's name. Its mission was simple but powerful: support homeless teens, kids just like me who had been discarded by those who should have protected them. The foundation provided shelter, scholarships, and most importantly, a sense of belonging. The first night the shelter opened, I sat in the common room watching a boy about 14 sketching nervously in the corner. His eyes lit up when I showed him my old sketchbooks, pages filled during nights on sidewalks under dim street lamps. "People said drawing was a waste of time," he muttered. I smiled. So did mine. But look where it got me. That boy's grin was all the proof I needed that Harold's legacy was alive. Of course, rumors spread about the inheritance. Old classmates suddenly reappeared in my inbox, eager to catch up. Distant relatives called, spinning stories of how much they had always cared for me. But Harold's words guided me. Money reveals people's true nature. I learned to separate the genuine from the greedy. Not everyone wanted something. Some neighbors brought me casseroles when grief weighed too heavily for me to cook. A retired teacher wrote me a letter about how Harold once secretly paid for her surgery. Those gestures reminded me that while greed was loud, gratitude and kindness whispered steadily in the background. And slowly I healed. Years passed. My art grew beyond sketchbooks into gallery walls and public murals, vibrant swirls of color telling stories of pain turned to resilience. The critics praised them, but I painted for Harold, for the man who had given me a home when no one else would. One mural in particular drew attention, a towering portrait of Harold, painted on the side of the shelter. His kind hazel eyes looked out over the city, his gentle smile forever watching over the children who came seeking refuge. Beneath the portrait were the words he had lived by: "Real wealth is compassion." The day the mural was unveiled, dozens of teens cheered, clapping and whistling. Some cried. And for the first time since losing him, I felt Harold's presence beside me, proud and steady. My parents never resurfaced publicly. Perhaps shame silenced them, or perhaps greed drove them elsewhere, chasing new opportunities. I didn't care. They had written themselves out of my story long ago. But sometimes, late at night, I wondered if they ever regretted it, if they ever realized that in casting me aside, they had forfeited not only Harold's wealth, but also his love. Maybe they thought money was the greatest loss. But I knew better. The true inheritance was something they would never understand. Looking back, my journey wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't plot their downfall or orchestrate their ruin. The universe, with Harold's steady hand, did that for me. My revenge was quieter, deeper. It was thriving in the face of their rejection. It was proving that the burden they had thrown away had become stronger, richer, not just in money, but in purpose. The day I signed the final papers for the foundation's expansion, A journalist asked me what it felt like to inherit so much. I paused, thinking of Harold's words, thinking of nights on cold sidewalks, thinking of children who would now have beds and hope. It feels, I said slowly, like a chance to keep a promise. To prove that family isn't always about blood. It's about who shows up. My grandfather showed up for me. Now I get to show up for others. The journalist smiled. That's not just an inheritance. That's a legacy. And I knew then that my story, from the night I was thrown out to the moment I became Harold's heir, was more than revenge. It was proof that resilience can turn rejection into redemption, and that sometimes the sweetest justice isn't taking back what you lost. It's building something greater than anyone imagined.